comes courtesy of our friends over at The View. When I say our friends over at The View, I mean the low IQ idiots who are on panel at The View. And yes, you are a complete stupid idiot. My God, she is so stupid. This is the same lady who thinks everything is racist. Everything and everyone is racist, except Hitler and the Holocaust. Genius.
It began, not with a whisper, but with a shot across the bow. For years, Ben Shapiro had watched The View dominate. Daytime television, a roundtable of celebrity panelists parading progressive politics under the guise of discussion. To millions of American households, it was comfort food, light chatter, familiar faces. But to Ben, it was something far more dangerous, a pipeline of emotional posturing and intellectual laziness. Broadcast 5 days a week, and he couldn't take it anymore. This isn't a talk show, he once said on his podcast. It's a shrine to the cult of feelings over facts. That sentiment marked the start of what would become one of the most unrelenting one-man crusades in modern media. While other conservatives rolled their eyes at The View, Ben loaded the receipts, dissected every soundbite, and turned their missteps into viral takedowns. He didn't just mock the show, he analyzed it, clip by clip, word by word. Where most people saw an awkward segment or a silly comment, Ben saw an opportunity to expose what he called the rot of mainstream discourse. The false equivalencies, the historical revisions, the applause for mediocrity. It wasn't just Whoopi, or Joy, or Sunny, it was the system, and he was going to call it out. One of his earliest viral critiques came after Joy Behar, in an impassioned monologue, claimed she understood the struggles of Black Americans because she was never considered beautiful growing up with pale skin and red hair. Ben didn't even raise his voice. He just raised his eyebrows and deconstructed the absurdity with quiet precision. The internet exploded. What shocked people wasn't that Joy said something tone-deaf that was routine. It was that no one at the table questioned it. No pushback, no reality check, just nods and applause. That was the moment Ben realized something deeper. The View wasn't just guilty of bad takes. It was actively insulating itself from truth. And worse, it was rewarding each other for it. That pattern became Ben's obsession. He turned every segment into a case study in what happens when feelings are allowed to overwrite facts. When popularity trumps principle, and when a daytime talk show begins shaping political thought more than elected leaders. The consequence of this, he argued, wasn't just dumb TV, it was a misinformed public. Viewers who believed they were getting educated were actually being entertained and indoctrinated. That, he warned, is how empires fall. Not in fire and fury, but in slow, comfortable ignorance applauded between commercial breaks. And so, Ben declared war. Not with anger, not with insults, but with documentation, consistency, and a fervent belief that ideas deserve scrutiny, no matter how loudly they're cheered. But what happens when the target of your criticism holds the microphone and the applause button? When the platform you're challenging controls the stage and refuses to let you on? That's where the story truly begins. Because Ben didn't just want to critique The View from the sidelines, he wanted a seat at the table. And they slammed the door in his face. Ben Shapiro never expected an invitation made of gold. But he did expect a reply. Time after time, tweet after tweet, podcast after podcast. Ben made it known he was ready. Not to shout, not to ambush, but to sit down, calmly, respectfully, and challenge the opinions being broadcast daily into millions of American homes. He wasn't looking for a fight, he was looking for a conversation. And that was the problem, because The View, for all its talk of inclusion and diversity of thought, never seemed quite ready for someone like Ben. They've welcomed presidential candidates, Hollywood activists, scandal-ridden celebrities, even controversial conservatives. But Ben? He remains conspicuously absent. Not once has he been invited to the famed hot table. And it's not because they haven't heard him. His critiques are impossible to miss. His name trends alongside theirs every time he responds. And yet, silence. Behind that silence, Ben sees fear. Not of him personally, but of what he represents. A brand of conservatism that doesn't flinch. That comes prepared, that speaks fast and thinks faster. He knows his facts, he knows their footage, and worst of all, he knows exactly how they'll respond. Don't invite Ben on The View. Would be to surrender the illusion of intellectual dominance. It would mean facing a guest who doesn't play by emotional rules, who doesn't cave to crowd reactions, who doesn't smile and nod when something doesn't make sense, and that, in a format built on agreement and applause, is dangerous. One clip illustrates the point. In an older episode, Meghan McCain, arguably the most conservative co-host the show has had in recent memory, tried to push back on a broad generalization made about Republicans. The result? She was talked over, mocked, and eventually edited. Down in post-production, if Meghan, the designated token conservative, couldn't land a full sentence without resistance, what chance would Ben have? He's said it himself. I'd last maybe 4 minutes before they cut to commercial. But still, he asks, not because he expects a fair fight, but because the refusal is the proof. Each time the producers pass over his name, it confirms what Ben believes, that The View doesn't want debate. It wants theater, and a well-prepared guest with a stack of studies doesn't fit the script. There's something deeply ironic about that. A show that claims to champion women's voices, racial justice, and intellectual empowerment, yet won't share space with someone who simply disagrees. In their effort to protect the conversation, they've actually stifled it. And that's the quiet lesson. Sometimes the most powerful form of censorship isn't cutting the mic, it's never plugging it in. But for Ben, this was only the beginning. The real battle would come not in the form of a snubbed invitation, but in a televised moment so shocking, so historically careless, that it ignited outrage far beyond political lines. It came from Whoopi Goldberg, and it shook him to the core. It was a quiet Monday morning when everything changed. The topic on The View that day was supposed to be simple. The panel was discussing a school district that had banned Maus, the Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel about the Holocaust. It was the kind of segment the show often tackled, serious, but framed through cultural controversy. And then, Whoopi spoke. She leaned forward, her voice calm but certain. The Holocaust, she said, isn't about race. It's about man's inhumanity to man. The room fell still. Too many watching at home. It sounded strange off. To Ben Shapiro, it was something far worse. It was reckless, it was wrong, and it was dangerous. Within hours, Ben took to every platform he had. YouTube, Twitter, The Daily Wire. He wasn't just angry, he was stunned. Ask the Nazis, he wrote. They sure as hell thought it was about race, and he was right. Nazi ideology was built on the belief in Aryan racial superiority. Jews were labeled not just by religion, but by blood. Grandparents were charted. Entire families were erased, not for what they believed, but for who they were. This wasn't opinion, it was historical fact. Ben wasn't reacting as a commentator. He was reacting as a Jewish man, the grandson of Holocaust survivors. And to him, this wasn't just a bad take. It was a public rewriting of the most well-documented genocide in history. He believed that moments like this, left unchallenged, chipped away at truth itself. What made it worse was how The View handled it at first. Nothing. No correction, no putback, just nods, a few confused glances, and a transition to commercial. The clip went viral. Historians weighed in. Jewish groups called for a retraction. And only after days of pressure did Whoopi issue an apology, one that many, including Ben, felt lacked real understanding. He explained why it mattered. When you strip race from the Holocaust, you make it easier to universalize, to soften, to blur its edges, and in doing so, you erase the very reason it happened. It becomes less personal, less pointed, and less urgent. The lesson here wasn't just about history. It was about how quickly truth can be reshaped when platforms prioritize comfort over clarity. It was about the danger of simplifying pain until it fits a narrative, and how easily that narrative, if left unchallenged, becomes the one millions remember. For Ben, this wasn't just another clip to critique. This was the line in the sand, and he knew. As long as The View kept speaking with that much confidence and that little research, there would be more moments like this. Moments where facts bent to fit feelings, where no one at the table said, "Wait, is that true?" The Holocaust comment lit the match. But it wasn't the last time Whoopi would shock viewers with a take that defied logic, history, and accountability. The next one would take her from rewriting the past to comparing the present in ways that were even harder to ignore. If you only watched The View with the volume turned off, it would look like a celebration, polished women at a sleek table, laughter floating between sips of coffee, confident hands waving through the air as applause rolls in like a drumbeat. But if you listen closely, something else emerges. It's not the noise that's troubling, it's the silence. Because on The View, silence doesn't mean no one is speaking. It means no one is challenging. No one is asking the hard question. No one is saying, "That doesn't sound right." Ben Shapiro picked up on that a long time ago. To him, The View has become less a place for discussion, and more a place for agreement. A table where differing perspectives are less welcomed, and more, tolerated, at best. And more often than not, avoided altogether. He's pointed out time and again, when Whoopi makes a sweeping, inaccurate claim, the other hosts don't push back. They glance sideways, shift topics, or simply smile through it. When Joy says something awkward or patronizing, the response is rarely correction. It's polite laughter or forced applause. It's all part of what Ben calls the culture of agreement, where everyone speaks with certainty, but few with substance. A perfect example, Meghan McCain. As the show's former token conservative, she often found herself steamrolled mid. She'd raise her voice to be heard, not to interrupt but to finish a thought. And the moment she diverged too far from the group narrative, you could feel the temperature drop. No one yelled, no one shouted her down, but the body language said everything. Crossed arms, pursed lips, and that uncomfortable pause before someone changed the subject. Ben saw that, and he didn't forget it. He believes that true conversation happens not when everyone agrees, but when they're willing to respectfully disagree, when an idea is allowed to breathe, be examined, and even be challenged. That's what The View, in his eyes, has lost, and perhaps what it fears most. He's spoken often about the danger of groupthink dressed in glam lashes, where disagreement is seen as aggression and complexity is flattened for comfort. When every opinion sounds eerily similar, and every correction is skipped to avoid tension. The result isn't peace, it's stagnation. A room full of smart people afraid to say something unpopular stops being a room of thinkers. It becomes a room of performers. And the cost isn't just boring television, it's something far greater, because viewers at home, young minds, casual voters, curious citizens, are learning from this. They're watching a model of conversation where conflict is dodged, dissent is softened, and facts are secondary. Two feelings. And when that becomes the norm, people stop expecting truth. They start settling for affirmation. Ben sees that clearly. He sees the risk of influence without accountability, of mass approval without critical reflection, and he's made it his mission to call it out. But as frustrating as the groupthink is, it was nothing compared to what came next. Because if silent agreement is dangerous, loud falsehoods are worse. And that's exactly what he found in Joy Behar. Whoopi Goldberg is the View's thunder, and Joy Behar is its lightning, unpredictable, loud, and always ready to strike with a punchline, whether or not it lands. Ben Shapiro, however, doesn't find her funny. To him, Joy isn't just a comedian with a political streak, she's a symbol of something more troubling, the kind of well-meaning liberal who tries so hard to say the right thing that she ends up saying the wrong thing, again and again. One moment, in particular, stuck with Ben and with millions who watched it unfold. During a segment on race and beauty standards, Joy leaned in and said, "I grew up in a world where a woman who looks like me, with my kind of skin and my kind of hair, was never considered beautiful." She paused, proud of the vulnerability, then turned to her black co-host and asked, "So, do my words resonate with you? Because you're a black person." The room froze. It was one of those moments that wasn't malicious, but was deeply awkward. A sentence built on a shaky bridge between empathy and ego. And for Ben, it was textbook Joy, trying too hard to show she gets it, and in the process, proving that she doesn't. He didn't explode in outrage. He didn't call her racist. Instead, he did what he always does. He broke it down. He explained how Joy's approach, while perhaps sincere in intent, often ends up being condescending in effect. That framing your own struggle as a white woman as equivalent to the generational trauma of black Americans isn't allyship, it's erasure. Ben called it performative compassion, where the goal isn't to understand, but to be seen understanding. And he pointed out how Joy's words, rather than lifting others, ended up centering herself. Again, it wasn't the first time. Joy has made a career of off-the-cuff remarks that swing wide of the target, from accidentally mixing up names of black politicians, to confidently stating things about communities she clearly doesn't belong to. She's built a pattern, and every time, the reaction is the same. An awkward giggle from the table, a chuckle from the audience, and then, nothing. No real correction, no deeper reflection. To Ben, that's the problem. Because in a world where social currency is built on being an ally, too many people are rewarded for appearances rather than outcomes. They get applause for showing up, even if they're saying things that do more harm than good. He's said before, real allyship doesn't mean talking over the people you claim to support. It means listening. It means shutting up sometimes. It means not making every issue about yourself. And that's the quiet lesson here. Good intentions aren't enough, especially when you hold a microphone that reaches millions. Especially when you sit at a table where others won't correct you. Because whether you mean to or not, your words shape how people think. But while Joy may have stumbled trying to support marginalized voices, Whoopi once again took things a step further. And this time, the target wasn't history or race, it was biology. And the right to speak. There are moments on live television when passion fills the room so quickly, it drowns out the point. That's exactly what happened when Whoopi Goldberg, mid-discussion on abortion rights, leaned into the camera and unleashed a thunderous monologue. Her voice shook with anger, her hands cut through the air, and the line that echoed across the country was this: "If you don't have eggs or the possibility of carrying a fetus, you have no right to talk about this." It was fiery. It was raw. And it was, for many watching, especially for Ben Shapiro, completely self-defeating, because while Whoopi thought she was drawing a line of defense around women's autonomy, Ben saw something else, a loud contradiction to everything the View claimed to believe about inclusion. He responded not with yelling, but with questions. What about trans men? Individuals who were born biologically female but now identify as male, many of whom can still get pregnant. What about non-binary people who don't identify strictly as men or women, but still navigate reproductive decisions? What about postmenopausal women who can no longer conceive? Are their voices now invalid too? And here's the most pointed. 1. What about allies, fathers, brothers, sons who care deeply, who support, who vote, but who by Whoopi's standard have no right to speak? Ben wasn't just nitpicking. He was revealing a larger issue, the dangers of weaponizing identity as a filter for dialogue. Because once we start deciding who can speak based on biology, we stop focusing on the content of what's said, and focus only on who's saying it. He pointed out the irony. The View often champions the idea that gender is a spectrum, that traditional roles must be rethought, that voices should be elevated regardless of norms. And yet, here was Whoopi, shutting down half the population based on the very definitions her show had previously challenged. That contradiction didn't just bother Ben, it fascinated him, because it highlighted what he believes is one of the biggest problems in modern media. When emotion becomes the referee of truth, he explained it this way: you can be angry, you can be passionate, but when you start using biology to silence people, especially in the name of progressive values, you're no longer protecting conversation, you're controlling it. And in that moment, what should have been an important discussion on reproductive rights, one filled with complexity, nuance, and shared concern, collapsed into a rigid us versus them shouting match. The takeaway wasn't just about abortion, it was about the cost of rhetorical shortcuts. When we shut people out of conversations instead of inviting them into hard ones, we don't solve anything, we just build new walls. Ben's reaction was calm, even clinical. He didn't mock Whoopi for her passion, he acknowledged it, but he challenged her logic because that's what he believes keeps democracy alive: the willingness to ask hard questions, even when emotions run high. And once again, no one at the table pushed back. But that wasn't the only time. Whoopi blurred the line between personal conviction and public misinformation, because in another moment, quieter, stranger, she turned her focus toward language itself. And Ben couldn't believe what he was hearing. Sometimes, the most surprising moments on television aren't loud, they're subtle, almost casual. A thought tossed out in passing, a comment meant to sound thoughtful or clever, but one that reveals something deeper, something quietly unsettling. That's exactly how it felt when Whoopi Goldberg took a segment on race and language down a path no one expected. She began reflecting on certain English words with negative connotations: blackmail, black sheep, blacklist, and then asked, with sincere curiosity, why is black always bad? Maybe it's time we rethink these words. It wasn't a joke, she was serious. And for a few moments, no one at the table really knew how to respond. At home, Ben Shapiro sat frozen. To most people, that kind of statement might feel well-intentioned, like someone trying to raise awareness about the hidden biases in everyday speech. But to Ben, it was something else, a symptom of what he sees as a growing trend: the rush to declare things offensive, without understanding where they come from, and without caring what the facts actually say. So, like always, Ben responded with what he knows best: research. He explained that words like blackmail and black sheep don't come from racial origins at all. Blackmail has roots in 16th century Scotland, referring to payments extorted under threat, the black meaning hidden or secret, not racial. Black sheep comes from the literal appearance of rare, dark-fleeced sheep seen as unlucky, not because of race, but superstition. Ben's point wasn't to dismiss racism, it was to protect language from being distorted by lazy assumptions. Because when we start rewriting etymology to suit a modern narrative, we lose more than accuracy, we lose trust. We begin to question every word, every phrase, not based on meaning, but on how they feel. And that, he argued, is a slippery slope. What struck him most wasn't that Whoopi got it wrong. It was that no one corrected her, no fact check, no follow-up, just quiet agreement, or worse, applause. To Ben, that's the real danger, not just misinformation, but the comfort of it. A room full of smart people nodding along because it's easier than interrupting, because it feels good to challenge the system, even if what you're challenging isn't real. He believes in the power of words. He knows how they shape minds, especially when repeated on platforms as large as The View. And so, when a phrase like blackmail is suddenly framed as racial, without evidence, and aired to millions, that isn't progress. That's confusion, dressed as activism. The lesson here is quiet but vital. Being careful with language isn't just about avoiding offense, it's about honoring truth. Because once we start bending words to fit our worldview, instead of letting them teach us something about history, about culture, about context, we're not expanding understanding, we're shrinking it. And for Ben, moments like this prove his larger concern, because it's not just about the words they say, it's about the ones they don't challenge. And nowhere was that silence louder than during Whoopi's next statement, a comparison so shocking. It didn't just blur the lines between fact and fiction, it crossed them entirely. There are moments when a simple sentence becomes something much bigger than itself, not because of what it says, but because of where it's said, who says it, and who's listening. That's what haunted Ben Shapiro the most, because on The View, when Whoopi Goldberg compared the United States and Israel to terrorist groups like Hamas and the Taliban, it wasn't just a slip, it was a statement, one that millions heard, and almost no one in the room pushed back. The moment was brief, almost easy to miss. But to Ben, it was everything. A mainstream television host, an EGOT winner, a household name, drawing a moral equivalence between democratic nations and groups that murder civilians, oppress women, and indoctrinate children. And no one at the table blinked. It wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. Ben's response, once again, was sharp but steady. He explained that such comparisons aren't just misleading, they actively distort reality. They hand talking points to extremists. They confuse the public. And worst of all, they soften the perception of evil by wrapping it in the language of moral balance. He reminded his audience, Hamas isn't just a political faction. It's a designated terrorist organization responsible for suicide bombings, kidnappings, and countless civilian deaths. To casually place them on the same moral shelf as Israel or the US isn't brave. It's reckless. But what truly unnerved Ben wasn't just the false comparison, it was the absence of correction, the silence that followed, the nods, the applause, because when misinformation meets influence, it doesn't just echo, it spreads. And that's where Ben believes The View becomes more than a bad show. It becomes a cultural amplifier, a place where simplified takes, poorly researched claims, and emotional shortcuts are repackaged as mainstream wisdom. He's said it often, you don't need a megaphone to shape public opinion. You just need a couch, a camera, and no one to say, that's not true. And when no one does, when fiction is treated like insight, and distortion goes unchecked, that's when ignorance becomes influence. That's when ideas don't just exist, they take root. The quiet lesson here is clear, platforms matter, voices matter. And when those voices forget their responsibility, the consequences aren't just academic, they're real. They affect how people vote, how they protest, how they teach their children. To Ben, that's the fight. Not against personalities, not against politics, but against the slow, subtle erosion of truth in places where it should be protected most. And, as The View continued to fumble its way through complex topics with surface-level certainty, there was one more piece of the puzzle that made Ben's frustration boil over. Because misinformation is bad, but when the audience starts clapping for it, that's when it becomes something much worse. Long after the studio lights dim, after the credits roll and the hosts go home, The View doesn't really end. It just shifts platforms. And that's where the second half of the story begins, not on television, but online. For Ben Shapiro, what happens in the comment sections, quote tweets, and subreddit threads is just as revealing as what happens on air, because it's there, in the unfiltered scroll of opinion, where the real cultural battle plays out, where viewers become warriors and every clip becomes a line in the sand. The moment Whoopi said the Holocaust wasn't about race, social media didn't just react, it erupted. On one side, you had people defending her, arguing she was misunderstood, taken out of context, or simply trying to humanize history. On the other, a wave of critics, including Holocaust survivors, Jewish organizations, historians, and yes, Ben Shapiro demanded accountability. Hashtags like #FireWhoopi and #HolocaustHistory began trending within hours. And it wasn't just that moment. Every time a segment aired that felt off, whether it was Joy's awkward alley, Whoopi's comparisons to terrorist groups, or the dismissal of opposing views, a flood of reaction followed. Some viewers applauded the courage, others called it delusion. Threads on Reddit would run hundreds of comments deep. Twitter would fracture into echo chambers. YouTube clips would rack up millions of views, thousands of likes, and just as many angry replies. It became clear The View wasn't just a show anymore. It was a lightning rod. Ben often points to this online chaos as proof of something larger, that the culture isn't as unified as television tries to make it seem. That beneath the polished panels and studio applause, people are genuinely wrestling with these ideas. They're questioning, pushing back, debating fiercely in places where real-time feedback can't be edited out. And in that chaos, Ben sees a glimmer of hope, because disagreement, even messy and angry, means people are still paying attention. It means not everyone is nodding along. It means the conversation, the real one, is still alive. Just not always where the cameras are pointed, but he also sees the risk. Because when debate becomes a battlefield, when every post is a punch, people stop listening. They start picking sides before the argument even begins. They stop caring about truth, and care only about who said it. And that, he warns, is how misinformation wins, not by being louder, but by exhausting everyone else into silence. So he keeps showing up podcast after podcast, video after video, not just to argue with The View, but to keep that debate going where it matters most, with the people, the viewers, the ones still reading, still watching, still asking, wait, is that true? But for all the digital noise, there's still one thing that hasn't happened. The moment Ben's audience has begged for, imagined, even memed into existence, a face-to-face confrontation, a real seat at the table. And if that day ever comes, it won't be just another episode. It'll be something the internet will never forget. It's the question that's lingered for years, whispered in comment sections, speculated in podcasts, imagined in thumbnails with red arrows and fiery titles. What if Ben Shapiro actually walked onto the set of The View, not as a clip commentator, not as an outside critic, but as a guest? In the chair, at the table, facing the very hosts he's dissected, challenged, and called out for years. It's a moment fans have begged for, and producers have likely dreaded. Because if it ever happened, it wouldn't be quiet, it wouldn't be smooth. It would be unforgettable. Ben wouldn't come in swinging. He'd come in steady. A legal pad in his mind. Footnotes loaded. Statistics ready. He wouldn't yell, he'd ask questions. He wouldn't interrupt, he'd wait for the contradiction, then calmly pull the thread. Joy Behar might toss out a moral generalization. Whoopi might lean on legacy. Sunny might quote a study without the source. And Ben, he'd listen. Then strike, not with outrage, but with logic. Cold, precise, disruptive logic. There'd be tension in the air. The audience wouldn't know whether to clap or gasp. The camera would pan between faces that suddenly don't seem so confident. Not because Ben was rude, but because he didn't play the game. And that's the fantasy, isn't it? The viral clip, the trending moment. The battle of ideas finally brought to the same stage. But maybe the fantasy says more about what people want than just entertainment. Maybe it reflects a hunger for real conversation, for accountability, for honesty on a stage that too often feels like scripted affirmation, a hunger to watch someone walk into a space where he doesn't belong and simply ask, "Why do you believe that?" And then wait for an answer that actually holds up. Ben has always said he doesn't need the last word. He just wants the honest one. And if that day ever came, if the producers finally picked up the phone and said, "Ben, we're ready," it wouldn't just be a ratings win, it would be a cultural reset. But until that moment comes, Ben stays where he is, on the outside, watching closely, documenting carefully, and reminding his audience of something simple, powerful, and increasingly rare. That truth, even when unwelcome, still matters. And that's where the story comes full circle. Not with a chair at the views table, but with the idea that maybe, just maybe, the louder someone is applauded on TV, the more important it is to ask, quietly and clearly, are they actually right? In the end, this wasn't just a story about Ben Shapiro versus The View. It was about something bigger, the clash between truth and theater, between emotional comfort and intellectual accountability, from Holocaust misstatements to moral comparisons with terrorists, from awkward allyship to weaponized language. We've seen how powerful platforms can shape or distort the national conversation. Ben's fight isn't personal, it's principled. He's not looking for applause. He's demanding honesty in history, in debate, and in media that claims to speak for millions, and maybe that's the real takeaway. In a world full of loud voices, what matters most is the one willing to ask the uncomfortable questions. Thank you so much for watching. If you found value in this breakdown, please hit the like button, subscribe for more unfiltered content, and share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, stay sharp, stay curious, and see you in the next one.